Hi, Kevin Franklin with Red Hat North American Public Sector Consulting. Um, Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the basics of deployment objects in OpenShift. Particularly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to deploy a very simple application in OpenShift, in this case, a Apache server. And I'm going to kind of go through and explain what objects, Kubernetes objects there are that are going to be created, what they do, kind of building on the presentation we have seen thus far. As part of that, I'm going to go into create a Kubernetes deployment and a deployment config, highlight some of the differences, and go through a little more detail. But without any further ado, on my screen right here, we can see that we're in developer view of my OpenShift cluster right now. You can see that there are no projects. So the very first thing I'm going to have to do is I'm going to create a new project. So let's just create a new project right now. All right, we have a new project. Let's switch to that project in my web view. And I just created this using the OC command line utility, OC new project, HTTPD deployment object being the name right here. And first things first, let's take a look at our Git repo. So this is going to be a very simple application right here. All right, we can see it's very simple, just a HTTPD server source to image sample application. Not going to go into that now, but source to image is a technique available in OpenShift for basically creating container images from application code. It's very useful in particular for sort of bootstrapping. Like right here, I have a simple index.html that I want to deploy. Apparently a very large file that I want to deploy. And I don't really honestly care to go through and make a container file right now. I just want to create a container image and get it up and running for now. So I'm going to use that. So there's a couple different ways I can do it. In this case, I am going to create it via the GUI. And I'm also going to show how to create, using a similar technique, how to do this via the OC command line utility. So go to the add menu in the developer view. Make sure you are in the developer view, not the administrative view. They're slightly different. The developer view is much more, shall we say, streamlined for a developer sort of viewpoint. What the parts of what you care about your application versus the administrative view is you're much more raw when dealing with the various components of the application. For those of you who've been using OpenShift for some time, the administrative view is basically what you had in OpenShift 3. The developer view is something newer in OpenShift 4. But without any further ado, we're going to hit import from Git. Going to put in my GitHub URL for my Git repo. All right, all right, a builder image detected, but I want to be specific. Make sure it's using Apache HTTPD, universal base image 9, fine with a name, fine with a deployment, Oh, right here, check marked. I wanted to create a route. Actually, I'm going to uncheck that for the time being. You'll see why, but let's create this. All right. So I just deployed this application. So right now we see the light blue circle. This is because right now if this pod trying to deploy as part of this deployment, it'll get an image pull backup error potentially because my source to image build is running. We can see it running right here. I can pull up the logs. It's generating it for me. Let's go to my topology. Trying to scale my pods. And I can see that it's attempting to deploy. Looks like it's deployed. I have the application up and running. My pod is up and running, but the problem is I have it now deployed in OpenShift. I want to reach it. So what objects have been created right now? So let's see, OC get all. So I have my pod, I have a service, I have a deployment, replica sets, build config, build, and an image stream. So Going back to the very basics, when we have a container, which is basically a Linux process that's been encapsulated using a specific standard, running inside of a pod. A pod again being my smallest schedulable component in Kubernetes. This pod, though, um, is being controlled by a replica set that is basically telling me that I want to, which is saying to Kubernetes how many instances of this pod I want running. In this case, I'm telling I want one running. It's saying that there's one run currently and one ready to take requests. This replica set was created by a deployment, which defines how I'm deploying the application. That is to say, like if I want to do a rolling deployment or A/B or blue-green testing, these sort of details. I also have, because I used a source to image build, I have a build and a build config, similarly to a deployment or replica set. The build config defines how I want to build this source to image application, and the build was an individual triggering of that. But right now I have my app up and running. I can't reach it. There's that service. The service makes the means that other applications deployed on the SDN of OpenShift can reach this. I want to be able to reach this from my local machine. How would I do that? Well, remember how I said I unchecked that make available from outside the route box? I'm going to use an OC expose command to create a route. A route basically points to a service. In this case, I've run OC expose to expose the service, creates a route. So now if I do OC get all, I can see right here a route define, or OC get route. And I can see that I now have a new host name defined that if I were to copy this and throw it in my browser, I can reach my application just fine. It's deployed. It's now accessible from the outside world. So we can see these are the basic components, the basic Kubernetes objects you're going to need for deployment. For those of you who are completely new to Kubernetes, you're asking, okay, so why do I need a replica set? Why do I need a deployment? I don't need to do A/B testing. I don't need to do blue-green. I don't need to do a rolling deployment. I just want my container up and running. Okay, well, I've created a orphan pod definition. We can see right here, it's a very, very, very simple definition. It's just going to deploy another instance of my HTTPD application. And I'm just going to run OC create cacf on my file. What I'm telling OpenShift is basically create whatever is defined in the CYAML file. And in this case, it's my orphan pod. Whoops. There, my orphan pod was created. Now, if I go back to my web console, oh, look at that. My orphan pod is up and running. All right, that's cool. So now what happens if I delete that pod? So let's see, OC get pods, OC delete. I can. All right, I've deleted my pod. So now if I go back to the web console, it's gone because Kubernetes, in this case OpenShift, has done exactly as I asked it to. It deleted the pod. It's no longer there. So let's take this a step further. So as I mentioned previously, I have this deployment, this replica set. This replica set is controlling how many instances. It's basically kind of ensuring that I have pods scheduled. What happens if I deploy the pod that is being controlled by that replica set? This one right here, ignore the build container. We could actually delete that if we want. So actually, let's see, delete pod HTTP or delete PD -ex Windows. Oh, I promise you I can spell. All right. So OC get all. All right, I can see I have my one pod that's running. What happens if I delete this pod? Helps if I don't say pod twice. There we go. deleted. Now let's go back to the web console. Oh, we can see, well, that was actually very fast. Maybe I should make this smaller to make clear what is occurring. So we can see kind of in two views at the same time. OC get pod. We can see that a new instance is running. We can see that the assigned name doesn't match right here. So I could just do this again, OC delete pod. Not sure why it's not wanting to tab complete for me at the moment, but we'll. All right, we can see the pod scale to 0, and it's going to try to create another instance, and it's up and running. Again, because this is a very, very lightweight application, it comes up pretty quickly. But the replica set is what's allowing me to basically create on the fly, or rather, OpenShift, telling OpenShift, all right, if this pod dies, create a new instance. So if I were to scale this up, right here, I could edit, increase scaling to 2. And I were to delete one of these, all right, we can see it saw that, and it scaled as needed and appropriate. It saw that one of the pods was dead, spun up another instance. If I would have run this, we would have seen a temporarily desired of 2, current of 1, ready of 1, and it would have been scaling up to match. All right, so that's the basics of the deployment object. And I should note that the deployment object and the deployment config, which I'm going to show next, are very, very similar. I'm going to get into later how they actually differ slightly. Quick note, the deployment and the replication set are the preferred means at this point, but the deployment config isn't going anywhere for the time being. So I'm going to create a new object, a new project. It is a new project. Let's switch projects. Deployment config. Nothing deployed here. I'm actually going to deploy this via the command line. Previously, I went through the web console. I'm going to do the exact same thing through the command line. All right. Got my application up and running. OC get all. I can see a build is running. I can see my deployment config right here. Waiting for telling me that I have a desired one pod waiting to that I want deployed, a current of 0. It's basically waiting to deploy a new pod for the build to complete. Running right now. All right, and it's deploying. All right, and we're solid blue here, or solid dark blue, and our deployment config shows 111. And we can also see that a replication controller has started. So OC get RC, desired current ready 111. So it's ready to take in requests. Again, I forgot to, sorry, I need to create a route. Again, a route is what makes a service externally accessible from OpenShift. Quick caveats to routes: they are basically only designed for web requests. If you need to do something kind of custom beyond that, there are other means to expose services. Let's get that route host name. Whoops. There we go. There's the host name. Ba, 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 ba. And we can see that our application is up and running again. Again, these URLs do, in fact, differ, as you can see. All right. And now that we're, but again, very, very, very similar results to the previous mechanism of using a deployment config. The key takeaway here for a deployment config versus a deployment, there are some differences, very, very nuanced, between the capabilities a deployment config provides versus a deployment. I'll go into that a bit more in my presentation, but the big thing here is the philosophy behind their design. Deployment configs were designed with consistency in mind versus deployments were designed with availability. And to put it bluntly, deployment configs date back to the early days of OpenShift 3, which is Kubernetes, I believe, 1.1 offhand. The deployment did not exist at the time. It was a very, very trying to manage your containers in Kubernetes 1.1 using replication controllers was comparatively difficult. Deployment configs gave you support for things like blue-green deployments, rolling deployments, those sort of things that are now in the deployment Kubernetes native first-order object. Deployment config was originally unique to Red Hat, and the Red Hat actually did try to get the community to adopt the deployment config, but the learning from sort of, shall we say, the lessons of the deployment config, the deployment object was instead created. It's very, very similar, provides very, very similar capabilities. If you are going to, if you are deploying, if you're creating a new deployment of your application, it's recommended to use deployment and the replica sets rather than the deployment config and replication controls. Again, they are very, very similar, but the key, but it's generally a one-to-one. There's pretty close feature parity. It's more of in the edge cases, and sometimes there's just a different way to do things. But that's it for this.